The air in the shelter was thick with the smell of wet fur and old, damp wood. The floors were covered in layers of mud that never seemed to dry, and the walls seemed to echo with the cries of dogs who had been abandoned, forgotten, and left behind. It was a place on the outskirts of town, hidden away from the bustling streets, and few ventured to this remote corner. The people who came to this shelter usually had no other choice, either overwhelmed by too many animals or searching for a lost pet. The lucky ones left with hope, but most were left behind, forgotten in the cold, silent darkness of this place. Among them was Rex. Rex was a German shepherd, but his once majestic coat had been worn down to a patchy, scarred mess. His body was tense, his muscles coiled in constant readiness, and his eyes, oh, his eyes, spoke volumes of a pain that no dog should endure. He had been betrayed by the humans he had once loved and trusted, and as a result, his reputation had grown into one of aggression and relentlessness. The staff at the shelter had all but given up on him. Too dangerous, they would say, shaking their heads. Unmanageable. He won't change. Rex was a ghost in the shelter. The other dogs had their own interactions, their own attempts at bonding with the visitors, but not him. He stayed in his corner, eyes narrowed, watching with a quiet rage. His fur, once thick and full of life, had been reduced to a dull, patchy coat. His ears were tattered from years of abuse, and his muzzle was marked with old scars that told a story of fights fought and lost, each one a betrayal. When the staff tried to walk him, his leash would pull taut, his hackles raised, ready to lash out at anyone who dared to get too close. He had long since given up on anyone being worthy of his trust. Anna came to the shelter by accident. She had no intention of adopting a dog. In fact, she had never even thought about it. Life had been busy for her: work, friends, the usual rush of day-to-day responsibilities. But that morning, something had been different. Her feet had carried her through the heavy rain to the shelter without her planning it. She had heard of this place, of course, but it was always a bit too far, too inconvenient to consider. And yet, here she was, standing at the entrance, the cold rain soaking through her coat, looking at the uninviting door of the shelter. As she stepped inside, the smell of wet dogs and stale air hit her immediately, but it wasn't the smell that made her pause. It was the sound, the quiet, desperate, broken sounds of the dogs in their cages. There was a heavy sorrow in the air, a weight that pressed down on her chest. The shelter wasn't clean, nor was it warm. The dogs paced, barked, and whimpered, each of them with a story of abandonment, cruelty, or neglect. Some of them had given up, some had hardened, and a few were still hopeful, their tails wagging as people walked by. A volunteer approached her, giving her a cautious glance. "You're here for a dog?" they asked, their voice thick with the familiarity of the shelter's grim reality. Anna nodded, unsure of why she had even come. "Be careful," the volunteer warned, gesturing toward a corner of the shelter. "There's one dog, Rex, who's a bit difficult. He's been here the longest, and frankly, we don't know what to do with him. He's dangerous." Anna followed the volunteer's gaze. There, in the furthest corner, was a figure. Rex. His dark eyes glowed in the dim light, his body stiff with tension. His coat, though matted and patchy, still had a certain regal quality to it. The scars on his body told of a long and brutal history. He had been through more than any dog should. His muscles were taut, and he stood still as a statue, staring at Anna with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. The volunteer sighed. "He's been here a while. He doesn't trust anyone. The staff tried to train him, tried to help, but it's just too much. He doesn't want anything to do with humans." But Anna couldn't look away. There was something about the way Rex stood there, so still and so full of pain, that struck her deep in her chest. She felt drawn to him, as if some invisible thread was pulling her toward him. Against all logic, against the warnings, she knew that she had to try. "I'll go see him," Anna said, surprising even herself with her own certainty. The volunteer frowned, clearly concerned. "Are you sure? He's not like the others. He might not let you get close. And if he does—" But Anna had already turned toward the cage where Rex stood, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Something inside her told her that he wasn't just another lost dog. He was something more, something that needed healing just like she did. As she approached the cage, Rex's body tensed even more. His eyes narrowed, watching her every step with sharp focus. The sound of the rain tapping on the roof above seemed to intensify in the silence between them. Anna stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle him. She didn't know what she was doing, but she could feel the weight of the moment. She wasn't here to adopt a dog, and she wasn't sure what she was supposed to do next. All she knew was that she had to try. "Hey, Rex," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible over the rain. She took a step closer, her hand extended in a gesture of peace. The dog's eyes flickered with distrust. His hackles were raised, his body ready to snap. Anna froze, sensing the danger in the air. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had stopped. Rex's gaze never left hers, and his breath quickened with a low growl rising from deep within his chest. Would he attack? Would he turn away? Would she walk away in fear like everyone else? Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, his lips loosened. Not in a smile, not in a welcoming gesture, but in a way that suggested he might not attack yet. But the walls between them were thick. Rex was a dog full of pain, a creature who had been abandoned and betrayed. It was going to take more than a few words to bridge that gap. Anna's hand stayed extended, trembling, but she did not pull back. She would stay. The journey had just begun. Days passed, and Anna couldn't get Rex out of her mind. Each night, she found herself thinking about his eyes, the way they had pierced through her with a mixture of distrust, pain, and something else she couldn't quite place. She kept returning to the shelter, despite the warnings, despite the hesitation in the eyes of the staff. Each time, Rex was still there, still in the corner, still so full of fury and fear. The rain had not stopped, and the cold air seemed to seep into the bones of the shelter, making everything feel even more desolate. But Anna couldn't turn away. Something inside her told her that she wasn't done. There was no plan in her mind, no clear path ahead, just the pull of a connection that she couldn't ignore. The first few times she returned, Rex's reaction was the same. He stood in the corner of his cage, his eyes fixed on her as if he were calculating every movement she made. His body was taut, muscles rippling under his scarred fur. The tension in the air was so thick that it felt like the shelter itself held its breath. Every step Anna took toward him was met with a deep, guttural growl, a warning to stay away. He would turn his back on her, retreating to the furthest corner, as if he wanted to disappear altogether. But Anna didn't give up. She sat at the edge of his cage, careful not to make any sudden moves. She didn't try to coax him with treats or toys, like the staff had suggested. She didn't want to force anything. She simply sat and waited. For hours she would sit there. The rain continued to fall, its rhythmic patter against the roof providing a strange comfort. Anna's hands would start to ache from not moving, but she didn't mind. She was learning the art of patience, just like Rex. It was on the third day that something changed, something small but significant. Anna had sat down, her back against the cold wall of the shelter. Rex was in his usual spot, pacing back and forth in agitation, growling softly as if he couldn't decide whether to be angry or frightened. Anna stayed still, her eyes never leaving him, not out of fear but out of curiosity. She could feel the pull between them again, that invisible thread. It was as if Rex was waiting for something, perhaps for her to prove she wasn't like the others. The moments stretched on. Rex's growls became softer, less frequent, and his pacing slowed. He was still watching her, his eyes flickering between mistrust and something softer, something hesitant. Anna, sensing the change, reached her hand out slowly, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. She had learned to be careful, to read his body language as best as she could. The last thing she wanted was to make him feel trapped. At first, he didn't respond, but his eyes softened, just for a moment, before he turned away again, as if ashamed to let her see that softness. Anna's heart tightened in her chest, but she didn't pull her hand back. She kept it out, an invitation, a sign of peace. It wasn't until the next day that Rex finally made a move. She was there again, sitting on the floor, her back against the cold stone wall. The rain had subsided, but the air was still heavy with moisture. Rex was pacing as usual, his tail stiff behind him. The growl was still present, but there was something different about it this time. Less hostile, more resigned, as if he was exhausted from the constant battle within himself. Then, out of nowhere, Rex stopped. He froze in his tracks, his body tensed as he turned to face Anna. For the first time, his stance wasn't aggressive. He didn't growl, didn't flinch away. He simply stood there, watching her, his chest rising and falling with every shallow breath. Anna's heart raced in her chest, but she didn't move. She had learned not to push him, not to force anything. She stayed still, hoping against hope that this moment, this fragile moment, would lead somewhere. And then, after what felt like an eternity, Rex made the first move. He took a single step forward. It was a slow, tentative movement, his body low to the ground, his eyes still fixed on hers. Anna held her breath, afraid to make a sound, afraid to move. The space between them felt like an ocean, vast and filled with uncertainty. But that one step, just one, was enough to send a wave of relief through Anna. He hadn't run. He hadn't attacked. He had chosen to take a step toward her. Her heart swelled with emotion, her eyes welling up with tears she hadn't expected. This wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was progress. For the first time, Rex had shown the smallest glimmer of trust. And for Anna, that was everything. For the next few days, the pattern continued. Rex would approach her a little more each time, his body still tense, still unsure, but with less aggression. Sometimes he would sit a few feet away from her, watching her with those penetrating eyes, and sometimes, just sometimes, he would allow her to come a little closer. He still didn't let her touch him. Not yet, but he didn't pull away either. Anna's patience never wavered. Each small step Rex took was a victory, even if it seemed insignificant to anyone else. She knew that Rex's trust wasn't something that could be rushed, something that could be forced. It would take time. It would take understanding. It would take patience. But she was willing to give him that. One afternoon, as she sat near his cage, her hand resting just outside the bars, something unexpected happened. Rex's eyes softened for a brief moment, and he stepped closer. This time, he didn't turn away. Slowly, so slowly, he reached out his nose and nudged her hand. It was a brief, delicate touch, but it was enough to send Anna's heart soaring. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. Rex had taken the first step, and she would be there to guide him through every other one. The days blurred together as Anna continued to visit Rex. With each passing moment, her heart grew heavier with a strange mix of love, fear, and hope. She had become a fixture at the shelter, often the last to leave, the quiet hum of the lights overhead and the soft murmur of dogs in their cages the only sound accompanying her. Rex remained a mystery to her, so full of pain, so full of distrust, but she couldn't walk away. There was something about him, something that kept her coming back, even on the days when the progress felt non-existent. Rex's progress, while real, was agonizingly slow. Some days he would step closer to her, nudging her hand with his nose, but only for a second before pulling away as though he remembered the pain of human hands on his body. Other days he would retreat to his corner, his body rigid with anger and fear, as if he had no strength left to try. Anna felt the weight of it all, the endless cycle of hope and despair that came with each attempt. One afternoon, as Anna sat near his cage, she noticed that Rex was standing unusually still. His body was tense, his eyes fixed on her, and for a moment, she feared the worst. He had been agitated the past few days. More withdrawn, more on edge. She wasn't sure what had triggered it, but it was clear that he was struggling with something. His breathing was shallow, and his tail, once stiff with guardedness, was now tucked low between his legs. He seemed more lost than ever. She could feel the shift in the air, the tension, the unease, and she knew she had to be careful. One wrong move could undo everything they had worked for. "Hey, Rex," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The shelter was quieter than usual, the other dogs unusually calm, perhaps sensing the stillness around them. "It's okay. I'm not going anywhere." Rex's eyes flickered to hers, and for a moment, she thought he might lash out. His growl was low, rumbling deep in his chest, but it wasn't as fierce as it used to be. It was almost as if he was trying to find his voice again, trying to summon the strength to react as he always had. But this time, something in Anna's heart shifted. She wasn't afraid. The fear she had once felt when facing his growls and snarls had dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of compassion. "I'm not like them," Anna murmured, reaching her hand toward the bars of his cage. "I know you're hurting. I know you've been through so much. But I'm here, Rex. You're not alone anymore." Rex's eyes met hers, filled with a wild, broken kind of sadness. His body trembled ever so slightly, and for the first time in weeks, Anna saw something in him that made her heart ache. A deep, aching vulnerability. He was afraid, not just of her but of everything he had been through. He had been betrayed, hurt, and abandoned. His whole life had been one long series of losses. How could he trust again? But Anna wasn't going anywhere. She had made a promise to herself and to him, even if he couldn't understand it yet. She wouldn't give up. She sat for hours that day, not asking anything of him, just being present. She didn't try to touch him, didn't try to coax him with words or treats. She simply existed in the space with him. There was a kind of quiet comfort in that, an understanding between them that, despite everything, neither of them were truly alone. The following days brought more of the same. Rex's behavior was erratic, sometimes calm, sometimes agitated, but Anna stayed by his side. She talked to him softly, telling him about her day, about the world outside the shelter, about the little things that made her smile. Sometimes, when she spoke, she could see a flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of recognition that she wasn't like the others. He was still distant, still cautious, but he had begun to tolerate her presence. That was something. It was progress. And then, on the 5th day after their quiet afternoon together, something remarkable happened. Rex didn't retreat when Anna entered the shelter. He didn't growl. He didn't pace. Instead, he stood still, watching her with those deep, sorrowful eyes. Anna took a deep breath, her heart racing. She approached him slowly, giving him space, letting him make the decision. She extended her hand toward the bars of his cage, her fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the raw emotion of the moment. "Rex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's okay. You can trust me. I won't hurt you." For a long moment, Rex didn't move. The air was thick with the weight of his decision. And then, slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward. His nose brushed the tips of her fingers, tentative, unsure, but not hostile. The world seemed to stand still. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She could hardly believe what was happening. It was a small gesture, just a brief touch, but it was everything. It was trust. It was the first real step toward healing. Her heart soared. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that there would be setbacks and moments of despair. But in that moment, she felt something shift in both of them. Rex had made a choice. He had chosen to trust her, even if just for a moment. And that was the beginning. Anna spent the next few weeks continuing to build their bond. She remained patient, letting Rex guide their interactions. There were days when he would back away, his body tense and his eyes wary. But there were more days when he would stand a little closer, let her hand rest just a little longer on the bars, or even nudge her palm with his nose. Each moment felt like a tiny victory. And through it all, Anna never stopped talking to him, never stopped telling him that he was safe, that he was loved. Slowly, the walls Rex had built around himself began to crumble. As the weeks passed, Anna began to feel a sense of hope blooming in her chest. Maybe they were both broken. Maybe they were both scarred in ways no one could see. But together they could heal. Together they would find peace. The shelter had grown colder with the onset of winter, and the rain fell almost daily, tapping softly against the old roof like the world outside was echoing the quiet sorrow within. The dogs in the shelter had become quieter, the usual barking replaced with low whimpers and sighs as the harsh chill took its toll. Yet, amidst this dreary, bleak atmosphere, something was shifting. A subtle, almost imperceptible change was taking place, not only in the weather, but in Rex himself. Anna had begun to spend more and more time at the shelter, and each visit left her with a bittersweet feeling of both triumph and uncertainty. Rex's progress was slow, agonizingly so, but every small moment of connection made the struggle worthwhile. She never rushed him, never pushed him beyond what he could handle. She had learned, perhaps more than she ever anticipated, the art of waiting, of being patient with a soul that had been hurt beyond imagination. The most remarkable change had come in the way Rex responded to her presence. Where once he would turn his back on her, now he stood still, watching her with an intensity that was both unsettling and heartbreaking. His body, still guarded and stiff, had softened just a little. When Anna approached his cage, his growl had diminished to a low, rumbling sound, more of a reflex than a warning. It wasn't aggression. It was just his way of saying, "I'm still not sure about this." But this time Anna didn't feel fear. She only felt compassion. Compassion for a dog that had been wronged in so many ways by people, and who, despite everything, was still willing to try again. On one particularly cold afternoon, Anna entered the shelter with a quiet determination. The rain had been falling heavily that day, a constant downpour that left the world outside in shades of gray. She hadn't seen Rex in a couple of days due to her work schedule, and the thought of him being alone in the shelter, surrounded by his fears, made her ache with a deep, empty feeling. She couldn't bear to think of him withdrawing again, isolating himself further. When she approached his cage, she saw him standing in the back, his eyes narrow and wary, but not hostile. He was waiting. She could see it in the way his body had relaxed ever so slightly, the way his ears perked at the sound of her footsteps. There was something different today, something quieter and less uncertain in his posture. "Hey, Rex," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. She knew better now than to approach him too quickly or too eagerly. She stood still, letting him assess the situation on his own terms. "It's me, Anna. I'm not going anywhere." For a long while, Rex didn't move. His eyes flickered between her and the corner of the cage, as if he couldn't quite decide if he wanted to come closer or retreat. The weight of the silence stretched between them, and Anna's heart beat in her chest like the ticking of a clock, slow, steady, full of anticipation. But she remained patient. She had learned to trust in the process, in the healing that could only come with time. Then, in an unexpected shift, Rex did something he hadn't done before. He took a slow step toward her. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She didn't move, didn't dare to reach for him just yet. She wanted this to be his choice, not hers. He stopped just a few feet from her. His eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her heart ache. He was so close, yet still so far away. "I'm here," Anna murmured softly, as if he needed to hear the words. She didn't ask for anything more, just the quiet assurance that she would be there whenever he was ready. And then, for the first time in what felt like forever, Rex did something that nearly broke her heart. He nudged her hand, just barely, with his nose. A small, tentative touch, but one that spoke volumes. It wasn't a leap of trust, not yet, but it was a step. And that step was all Anna needed. Her hand trembled as she slowly, carefully, stroked his head through the bars of the cage. It was a soft touch, full of tenderness, and she could feel the way Rex flinched, just for a moment, before settling into the contact. He didn't pull away. He didn't snap. He simply let her touch him, just this once. Anna's heart soared, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe, truly believe, that healing was possible. Not just for Rex, but for herself as well. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. As the days went on, their connection deepened, little by little. Rex began to seek her out when she arrived, his tail low, but his stance no longer as defensive. He would stand by the bars of his cage, waiting for her to approach, his eyes softening whenever she spoke to him. The growls had disappeared almost entirely, replaced by a quiet alertness, as though he was unsure of what to do with the gentle attention Anna offered. One particularly cold evening, Anna arrived at the shelter to find Rex standing at the front of his cage, as usual. The staff had noticed the change in him too, and they marveled at the progress he was making. But it wasn't just Rex who was changing. It was Anna too. She sat down on the floor outside his cage, not bothering to stand or move closer. The rain had returned in full force, pounding against the windows with the familiar rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her visits. As the hours passed, Anna began to talk to Rex, her voice low and steady. She told him about her day, about the people she had met, about the things that made her laugh and the things that made her sad. She shared pieces of herself with him, and in return, she saw his eyes soften, just a little. The shelter felt quieter that night, the sounds of the other dogs barely noticeable in the background. It was just her and Rex in that moment, a bond that was still fragile, but growing stronger with every passing second. When Anna stood to leave, something remarkable happened. Rex, who had always stayed in the back of his cage, now followed her with his eyes. He was no longer watching her with suspicion or anger. His gaze was softer, warmer, as if he was beginning to understand that she wasn't just another human who would leave him behind. "Good night, Rex," Anna said, her voice full of emotion. "I'll see you tomorrow." And for the first time, Rex didn't retreat to the farthest corner of his cage. He stayed right where he was, watching her with those soulful eyes. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the end of their journey, but it was a new beginning. Winter had fully settled in, the cold air seeping into the walls of the shelter, but a quiet warmth had begun to grow between Anna and Rex. The months of patience and persistence were starting to bear fruit, and while the road to full trust was still long, every day felt like a step closer to something they had both been yearning for: healing. Rex's progress had been slow, but it was undeniable. The scars on his body had always been visible, but now, Anna saw the quiet signs of his spirit starting to heal as well. Anna arrived at the shelter each day, sometimes before dawn, sometimes in the late hours of the evening. She had come to expect the same ritual, sitting by Rex's cage, letting him come to her on his own terms. The bond between them was fragile, but it was becoming something real. Anna could tell that Rex was beginning to trust her, not just with his body but with his heart. It wasn't the easy, joyful affection she had experienced with other dogs. It was something deeper, more meaningful. His trust had to be earned every single day, and Anna was willing to spend her whole life earning it if that was what it took. One afternoon, the shelter was quieter than usual. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy fog in the air, and the chill of the season seemed to settle around them like a blanket. Rex had been pacing the back of his cage, as was his habit, but when he saw Anna standing in front of him, his eyes softened. There was something different today. The air felt lighter, as though the tension that had built up over the past months had finally started to dissolve. Anna sat down as she always did, her legs crossed, her hand resting just beyond the bars of his cage. It was a simple gesture, but it had become a ritual. Slowly, she extended her fingers toward him, feeling the familiar pulse of nervousness in her chest. Would he pull away today? Would he growl or retreat? Instead, Rex did something unexpected. He took a step forward, his head dipping toward her outstretched hand, his nose brushing her fingertips with the same tentative curiosity he had shown before. But this time he didn't pull away. This time he lingered. His breath was warm against her skin, and Anna could feel his heart pounding, just like hers. It was a small thing, barely more than a whisper of a touch, but it was a victory. The first real sign that Rex was starting to understand that not all hands were meant to hurt him. "Good boy, Rex," Anna whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She could feel her heart swelling in her chest, her eyes stinging with tears. This was it. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. Slowly, she let her hands stay where it was, offering him the comfort he had never known. And this time he stayed. As the days passed, Rex's transformation continued. The once dangerous growls had faded into soft whimpers, and his body language had shifted. He would no longer retreat to the back of the cage at the sound of Anna's voice. Instead, he would stand by the bars, his head held a little higher, his eyes no longer filled with distrust but with quiet curiosity. He still wasn't ready to leave his cage, but he was beginning to allow Anna closer. Anna knew that this was only the beginning. Trust wasn't a one-time thing. It was something that had to be rebuilt from the ground up, one small piece at a time. But she was ready for that challenge. She had never felt so deeply connected to another being in her life. Rex wasn't just a dog she had met by chance. He was her partner in healing, her mirror, reflecting the parts of her soul that needed to be nurtured. The shelter staff began to notice the change as well. They had watched, at first in disbelief, and then in awe as Rex's behavior became less aggressive and more open. They had seen other dogs come and go, but none had quite the history of pain that Rex did. His transformation was nothing short of a miracle, a testament to the power of patience, compassion, and love. The staff began to allow Anna to take Rex on longer walks, though they still made sure to keep a close eye on him, as his trust in humans was still fragile. But with each walk, with each new experience, Rex seemed to grow more confident. It wasn't long before the shelter staff started talking about Rex in a different way. No longer was he the dangerous dog or the one who couldn't be saved. He had earned a new reputation. He was the dog who was learning to trust again. And his story began to spread, inspiring the volunteers and staff alike. One cold morning, Anna arrived early, eager to see Rex before her day began. As usual, she stood in front of his cage, letting him come to her at his own pace. But this morning, something was different. Rex didn't hesitate. Without a moment's pause, he approached the bars and stood directly in front of her. His eyes focused on hers with a steadiness that made Anna's heart skip a beat. His body was no longer coiled with tension. Instead, it was relaxed, his posture more at ease. Anna's heart surged in her chest as she reached out toward him. "Rex," she whispered, her voice full of warmth. "You're ready, aren't you?" With a soft breath, Anna opened the cage door, letting it creak open just a little. Rex didn't hesitate. Slowly, carefully, he stepped out of his cage, his paws landing softly on the ground. He didn't rush. He took his time, as if testing the world outside for the first time in a long while. Anna stood still, watching him, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when Rex finally stepped into the world with her by his side. He paused for a moment, his eyes meeting hers, as if seeking reassurance. And when Anna smiled, when she gently extended her hand toward him, Rex took another step, his tail flicking behind him for the first time in weeks. The bond between them had been tested, stretched thin, and slowly mended. But in that moment, with Rex walking beside her, Anna knew that they had both found something they had been searching for: hope, love, and the promise of a new beginning. Anna and Rex walked out of the shelter that day side by side. The rain had stopped, and the world outside seemed brighter, more open than it had ever been. They were no longer broken souls meeting by accident. They were a family, starting a new chapter together, one filled with healing, trust, and second chances. In the end, it wasn't just Rex who had been rescued. It was Anna, too.